First of all, thank you for letting me talk and for showing up. Um, I should say a couple of things. One, so when the questions come, despite the fact that I'm in California, you can ask questions in French or Italian. Those are languages that we speak here. Um, that was the first thing I was going to say. So the second thing I was going to say is that I'm trying to get my Bob Dylan book into French. We have a translator, we have a translation, but we don't have a publisher. So if any of you happen to be hanging out in Arles and you know the people from Actes Sud, you can just tell them that they should publish this book. Um, anyway, that's an aside. So I want to think in the paper that I'm going to give here about some structural, some moments in some of Dylan's lyrics um, where there seems to be a kind of overlapping or almost tension between events, the depiction of events, historical events, and a kind of mythological interpretation. And when I say mythological, I don't necessarily mean myth in the sense of Greek myth or Roman myth, but I mean the attempt to try and give a larger meaning to events through some kind of narrative structure, which is the etymological sense of mythos as being something that is told. Yeah, so that's what I'm going to, and so I'm going to have sort of three moments where I'll sort of jump through Dylan's work, and I will actually, because I realize we're in time and I forgot that you are all under curfew, I will try to move quickly, and I will actually jump over a kind of vaguely incoherent theoretical analysis at the beginning. I would like to, however, share my screen, and I will now do that. Okay. And because I have a PowerPoint, and this is the PowerPoint. We hope.
You have to open the PowerPoint before. Yeah.
There it is. So that's me, and that's the book. And if you meet the people at Actes Sud, you just tell them to call me. Everybody can see that, right?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So toward the end of his 2020 album, Rough and Rowdy Ways, Bob Dylan presents a song titled Mother of Muses. Mother of Muses, sing to me, begins the lyric. It is a prayer asking for inspiration, like Homer calling on the muse, as we just heard, to give him voice at the beginning of the Odyssey. Tell me, O muse, of the man of many ways, says Homer. Not surprisingly, Dylan goes on to ask for a relationship with Calliope, the muse of epic, and the mother of Orpheus. Yet what is surprising about Mother of Muses is that Dylan goes on to ask for a story of the great heroes of history. Sing of the heroes who stood alone. I'll go ahead and, yeah. Stood of the heroes who, sing of the heroes who stood alone, whose names are engraved on tablets of stone. These heroes are generals, principally Winfield Scott, who won the Mexican-American War, and Patton, Montgomery, and Marshal Zukov, who helped to win World War II. It was these generals, he points out, surprisingly, who made it possible for Elvis Presley to sing, presumably by creating a world of safety and democracy, and Presley, in turn, made it possible for Martin Luther King to do his work. Man, I could tell their stories all day. What is remarkable here, of course, is the extraordinary way in which Dylan's lyrics slides from the mythical world of the Muses, buried deep in the mists of time, to the modern world and right up to contemporary history. At one level, this is simply an effect of Dylan's enormous imagination. But it also goes to the heart of the idea of myth, which means etymologically, as I said, speech, thought, story, or legend, anything delivered by word of mouth. That's Little and Scott's Greek dictionary. For Dylan, it would seem the myths of history and the history of myths overlap. It is the overlapping of history and myth that I want to explore, or rather, I should say, the overlapping of history, myth, and song. Now, historical events, we know from Aristotle, are contingent, that is defined. You can point to them. By contrast, one of the characteristics of mythical structures is that they move outside of contingent events and are attached to them. Historical events happen once, myth returns again and again in different shapes as a way of explaining events and giving them a meaning. And I have a whole thing here about violence, and the general argument I would make is that one of the ways in which myth emerges is in response to violence, as a way of giving narrative structure to violent events. And I have a whole theoretical excursus here that I won't go into. But the important thing is to keep in mind the idea of myth as the response to violence. Myth is a way of giving narrative, so I'm jumping ahead. Myth is a way of giving narrative or figural form to something terrifying or inexplicable. One thing we need to take into account when we think about myth is how myth, that is fable, legend, story, overlays and transforms the fact of historical violence. This double structure, which is what I'm going to trace through Dylan's work, on the one level, some type of violent event, and on the other level, some type of myth or fable that reshapes that event, is relevant to Bob Dylan's work. For throughout his career, Dylan has been interested in focusing both on historical events and on the larger meaning of those events. He is a great historical writer, interested in what happened in the past, but he is also a great moralist who wants to understand historical events as fables about identity and responsibility. We can see this kind of double concern in very clear terms in some of Dylan's earliest songs, what we might call his protest songs. I have in mind here two songs from 1963, Only a Pawn in Their Game and the Lonesome Death of Hattie Carroll, and I'll just give you a taste of that. Can you hear that? Well, that was the end of that. I wanted just to remind you of what that stuff sounds like. Dylan tells the story of the assassination of the civil rights leader Medgar Evers, who was killed in 1963 in Jackson, Mississippi by a white supremacist. Dylan evokes the killing at the very beginning of the song. He plunges us right into the middle of it, right? And from there, the verse moves on to take us through every action that is precedes the shooting of the bullet. But the verse concludes with the strange line, he can't be blamed, he's only a pawn in their game. And from there, the song moves back in time to explain the motivation behind this dreadful deed. Yet each verse ends with the moralizing tag that not only provides a context for what he has just said, it also completely reshapes the events that have just been described. In other words, Dylan tells us when he says he's only a pawn in their game, that this is not a song about a violent murder of a good man. It's a fable about power and about the structures of power. The song is not about Medgar Evers. It's about how the white working class people are manipulated by corrupt forces in society, by white politicians and journalists. And that is a quite different story. In other words, the event described in the song is only a pretext for a different tale. Only a Pawn in Their Game is a somewhat simple model of the type of double structure I'm trying to isolate, whereby Dylan simultaneously describes a violent historical event and then reinterprets that event as an element in a quite different story. Indeed, for all of its simplicity, the effect of Only a Pawn in Their Game is quite disturbing. And at the time of the recording, Dylan was criticized because it seemed that he was justifying the actions of the white racist by saying that he was only a pawn. What he was doing, in fact, was simply using the actions of the racist to tell a quite different story about power. Right? A somewhat more sophisticated version of the same strategy comes in another song from the same year, The Lonesome Death of Hattie Carroll. Here, Dylan recounts the story of the murder of a Black serving woman by a white racist named William Zanzinger. Dylan walks his listeners through the story. Through the situation. He paints a picture of a high society party in Baltimore, the insolent Zanzinger who strikes Hattie Carroll with his cane, her death, and Zanzinger's subsequent arraignment and the miscarriage of justice when he receives a 6-month sentence. At the end of each, so these are the facts, and at the end of each verse, Dylan asks us, the audience, to reflect on what all of this means. As the song unfolds, we are told again and again at the end of each verse that now is not the time to cry. There's a tension, in other words, between the story and its meaning. The meaning is only revealed at the end of the song when Zanzinger is given a prison sentence that is incommensurate with the gravity of his crime. In other words, the larger meaning of the story of Hattie Carroll, what we might call the mythical meaning, is only revealed through Dylan's different addresses to the audience, where he tells us how to react, like the chorus in a Greek tragedy. My point here is that in both of these songs, these early songs, we learn that the violent events of history, those events that you can read about in the newspaper, do not mean what we thought they meant. The murder of Medgar Evers is not an isolated crime. It is a metaphor for a larger system of racist corruption. Similarly, the murder of Hattie Carroll is not principally horrific because it is a murder, though that is bad enough. It is horrific because the killer is not punished as he should be. The violent event is not about itself, it's about the miscarriage of justice. And I would point out that this technique that Dylan uses in his early protest songs, where he gives us a depiction of an event and then an interpretation which is slightly different from what he's just told us, is very characteristic of his early writing and quite different from that of many of his contemporaries. If you go back and work through the lyrics of someone like Phil Oakes, who is Dylan's kind of foil in the early days as a writer of protest songs, Oakes gives us a story, and then he may give us a moralizing tag, but the moralizing tag simply repeats what is already going on in the story. Whereas in Dylan's case, there's always a kind of distance between what he has recounted and what he says it means. And I would also point out that a bit later in 1967, in his album John Wesley Harding, he's much closer to Phil Oakes. There's very little space between the stories that he tells on that album and the meanings that he ascribes to them. Whereas in these early songs, there's always a kind of tension. And that was one of the things that was a bit of a source of controversy, because people in the folk song community felt that Dylan wasn't towing the party line. These early examples of Dylan's mythographic impulse, if that's what we want to call it, give way as his career unfolds to more complicated models for thinking about history, historical events, and myth, or real life events and myth. And to offer a second set of examples, I would like to leap ahead about a decade to the 1976 album Desire, co-written with Jacques Levy. This is one of the moments in Dylan's career where tropes of what we might commonly call mythology appear. Here we find the relationship between myth and violence explored in almost programmatic terms in the song Isis. The song, which Dylan once described as a song about marriage, gives us the story of a hero who is unworthy of love. He marries myth in the form of a woman named Isis, recalling the Egyptian goddess of sex and regeneration, but he loses his wife and heads off on a quest that takes him into the frozen north. He falls in with a mysterious bounty hunter who we learn is looking for something. The narrator of the story begins dreaming of riches. I was thinking about turquoise. I was thinking about gold, he says. I was thinking about diamonds and the world's biggest necklace. The narrator's companion, on the other hand, is looking for a body, and any body will do, even, it would seem, the body of the narrator himself. And as the story unfolds, the two men become lost in the ice fields of the frozen north. The narrator's partner dies. The narrator buries him and returns home to find the woman he left at the beginning of the song. Now purged of his greed, he seems able to accept the responsibility of marriage and stop his wandering. The woman accepts him if he is willing to commit to her in a way that he could not before his adventure in the north. The song narrates the purification of the self, the effacement of greed. The bounty hunter is a double of the greedy narrator, and the trip into the ice fields teaches him that diamonds and gold are not the key to happiness. And so we get the mythical retelling of the breaking apart of a marriage and its eventual resolution. Isis heals the narrator and he is reborn. And yet, the larger implications of Isis may come more clearly into view if we set it next to another song from the same album. This is the uncomfortably autobiographical song Sarah, in which Dylan tells the story of his own broken marriage to his estranged spouse, Sarah Lowndes. He recounts their coming together and the happiness they have found. And the song reveals the truth of the situation. And in the last line, Dylan begs Sarah not to leave him. Sarah, Sarah, Scorpio Sphinx with an arrow and bow. Sarah, Sarah, don't ever leave me, don't ever go. The broken marriage that could be repaired through myth in Isis seems to be much more in danger in Sarah. Instead of the regeneration embodied in the mythical heroine of the Egyptian tradition, Isis, the goddess of rebirth, here we end with an image of the lady that suggests power, but also mystery, confusion, virginity, and violence, as a teller of riddles and a modern version of the goddess of the hunt, Artemis, the goddess of virginity, by the way. I don't want to make too much of these glancing mythological references in Isis and Sarah, but my point here is that the tension between events, biographical events, historical events, real life events, events you can point to on the one hand, and on the other hand, mythological reworkings of these events, seems on the Desire album to come about in a dialogue between songs across the record, as it were. This, after all, Desire, is the same album that contains Dylan's great protest song about the boxer Hurricane Carter, who was falsely accused of murder, and his tale of the mafia leader Joey Gallo, who was sent to prison and gunned down in a restaurant while having dinner with his family. Yet those two journalistic accounts of real life people are set in dialogue with the border ballad called Romance in Durango, which is about a boy who kills a man in a gunfight and tries to escape from the law by riding across the desert with his girlfriend on a horse while strumming his guitar. Do not try this at home, by the way. The two sets of murders work in dialogue, yet on different levels. One on the level of historical fact. We know there is a real Hurricane Carter, there was a real Joey Gallo, and on the other hand, on the level of a kind of myth, in the case of Romance in Durango. The dialogue between history and myth works on Desire across the album, between songs, rather than inside the same song, as was the case with Hattie, Carroll, and Only a Pawn in Their Game. My larger point here is that Dylan is constantly reflecting on how events in everyday life, violent attacks, death, murder, assassination, divorce, come to signify something bigger beyond themselves and often take on a quite different meaning from what they might first seem to present. Dylan is not an autobiographer like James Taylor. He doesn't tell us about his family, nor is he a purely topical songwriter like Phil Ochs. But neither is he a pure fabulist, content to spin out pleasing stories. Rather, he asks us to think about the relationship between violent events and the fictions that are made out of them. And he builds these reflections into many of his songs. In this regard, we could certainly point to some of his early 2000 work on albums such as Love and Theft, where a set of stories about typical characters unfolds over the barely disguised landscape of the Old South in the United States, a land of racism and inequality, of lynchings and chain gangs, and certainly the kind of fog of place that Matthew was talking about earlier around London. It reappears on Love and Theft in a kind of powerful way, because it's the Old South is kind of always there, but is sort of never mentioned really in specific. Okay, which brings me to my third kind of moment. The most powerful instance of Dylan's mythographic work comes in the song Murder Most Foul, which was released a year ago, just about now, and which takes us back to the Rough and Rowdy Ways album with which I began my talk. Here in this song, we get an extended recreation of a dramatic historical event, the assassination of President Kennedy. Oh, 'twas a dark day in Dallas, November 63, begins Dylan, the day that will live on in infamy. This last phrase quotes Franklin Roosevelt's description of the bombing of Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941, a day that will live in infamy. And the song goes on to describe the assassination of Kennedy as a plot by Southern racists to kill the president and install their own man, the Texan Lyndon Johnson, who was Kennedy's vice president. Among the many remarkable features of Murder Most Foul, perhaps the most amazing is the way it approaches the relationship of history and myth. Dylan unpacks the event that is the Kennedy assassination from the inside out. He turns it into myth as the song is unfolding, at the moment that we are being given the facts. The singular event of the death of one man, John Kennedy, becomes the national myth before our very eyes. Murder Most Foul takes us not only into the very unfolding of that terrible event, recreating it from the point of view of the victim, but into its subsequent impact on American culture, and even implicitly its significance for the current moment. Unlike a novel, Murder Most Foul never jumps around in time. There is no before and after structure, as one might find in many stories of this type, historical novels, for example. And yet the song achieves the miraculous literary effect of both recounting Kennedy's death and catching its later meaning, all at the same time. Not even Tolstoy, the greatest of historical novelists, was able to pull off a trick like this. Dylan carries out this literary magic, I think, chiefly through three techniques. The first has to do with the title of the song. It is, of course, from Shakespeare's play, Hamlet. It comes from the warning that the ghost of old Hamlet gives to his son when he reveals to him that he was murdered by his brother Claudius. Revenge this most foul and unnatural murder, he cries. It is most foul because it is fratricide and regicide. All murder is bad, says Hamlet, but this murder in particular takes on an extra charge of meaning. This Shakespearean reference sets up the song in several ways. First off, it creates a dialogue between an older generation, the ghost, and a younger generation, which must bear the burden of history. The past is past, but it is not past, since it is still here. The murder is done, but it is not gone. To the contrary, it is more present than ever before in the form of the ghost urging young Hamlet on. The second aspect of the song that needs elucidation is the status of the first person pronoun I that seems to tell the story. Dylan begins his album Rough and Rowdy Ways with a song called I Contain Multitudes. And I quote, I drive fast cars, I eat fast foods, I contain multitudes, he sings. The title and idea of I Contain Multitudes comes from a famous line by the American poet Walt Whitman in Leaves of Grass, I Contain Multitudes. So Dylan begins his album with the quintessential American poet, and he ends with Shakespeare. The Shakespeare reference makes it possible for him to take what he talks about in the opening song, namely multitudinousness, and to apply it in Murder Most Foul. That is, I Contain Multitudes offers the concept, the idea of a kind of multiple self. Murder Most Foul uses that idea as a narrative technique. It does this by constantly displacing the position of the I who is presenting the song. As the song unfolds, beginning in the second verse, it shifts into the first person. Hush, little children, you'll understand, begins the second verse. The Beatles are coming. They're going to hold your hand. Then he continues, I'm going to Woodstock. It's the Aquarian age. Then I'll go over to Altamont and sit by the stage. Here we get the evocation of a first-person narrator who is beginning a journey through the post-Kennedy culture of North America. First, he goes to the Woodstock Music Festival, the great symbol of peace and harmony. Then he goes to the Altamont Music Festival outside of San Francisco, where a man was beaten to death by the Hells Angels as the Rolling Stones were performing. The two festivals offer two visions of the culture of the post-Kennedy years. Dylan's persona, the I who is telling the story, is there at both of those events. And from there he goes on. I'm in the red light district, like a cop on the beat, living in a nightmare on Elm Street. And later, the day that they killed him, someone said to me, son, the age of the Antichrist has only just begun. Here we get the creation of Dylan's death as myth, as a parable of a longer process of American decline. But at the same time, the I of the narrator is also attached to Kennedy himself. We get an account of his thoughts and feelings on the way to the hospital. And this is what I quoted up here in the somewhere, right, the fourth line, where he says, I'm leaning to the left, got my head in her lap. Oh, Lord, I've been led into some kind of a trap. Thus, we get two different identities for the I who is telling the story. One is Dylan's persona, who goes to the Woodstock Festival. The other is, in 1969, the other is Kennedy, who dies in 1963. Dylan's manipulation of the first person pronoun, the I who contains multitudes, makes it possible for him to recount the facts of the historical event, and at the same time to point to its mythical status as a moment in the fable of American spiritual decay. It enables Dylan to take residence both inside Kennedy's head and inside our heads as he takes us both down the road to the hospital in Dallas and across our culture, from Woodstock to Altamont, from the Beatles to the Who. The song enacts in its very form the transformation of violence into myth. But this is not all. When Dylan says the Beatles are coming, they're going to hold your hand, he takes the name of a song, the first North American hit for the Beatles, I Want to Hold Your Hand, and applies it to our experience. The phrase is a quotation of an artwork, but also a piece of our collective experience. For after the death of the president, it is not mothers and fathers who hold the hands of their confused children, it is the Beatles. The allusion to a song by the Beatles opens up an entire motif that dominates the second half of Murder Most Foul. In the last verses, phrases from literature, music, and film are applied to the psychological and spiritual situation of the nation. So when Dylan says, living in a nightmare on Elm Street, this refers both to a famous horror movie, that is a cultural text, and to the fact that Elm Street in Dallas, Texas, was one of the streets down which Kennedy was driven on the way to the hospital. Right? In other words, Elm Street is both an historical site and a mythical site. And it goes on from there. You got me dizzy, Miss Lizzie. You filled me with lead, says Dylan, mentioning the name of his rock song by Larry Williams, later recorded by the Beatles. And a moment later, he says, what's new, pussycat? What'd I say? I said the soul of a nation been torn away. The mythical interpretation of the events of Kennedy's death goes hand in hand with the citation of two song titles, What's New, Pussycat by Tom Jones and What'd I Say by Ray Charles. The point here, I think, is that Dylan is telling us that we cannot talk about our own history without talking about the myths through which we understand it. He is asking us to think about the ways in which the language of popular music lends density to our attempts to speak about our own experience. We cannot tell the story of Kennedy without always already turning it into myth, since every phrase we use is already a song, a phrase from a film, or a quotation. The moment we try to speak of Kennedy, he is myth. And Dylan's job is to bring out all of the possible ramifications of this myth together, showing both how Kennedy's death infects every song we hear and how every song we hear becomes somehow about Kennedy, even long after he is dead. In this context, we can signal the crucial importance of the other figure who appears in the song. And I'm moving to the end because I know time is pressing. The curfew is pressing. The other important figure who appears in the song, this is the famous disc jockey known as Wolfman Jack. He shares a first name with Jack Kennedy, and he was famous for broadcasting from Mexico in the early 1960s, blasting rock and roll across the entire southwestern part of the country from a so-called superstation or pirate radio station called XERB. Wolfman, oh Wolfman, Wolfman howl, sings Dylan at the end of the first verse. The Wolfman becomes the voice of American music, haunting the song in the way that the ghost of old Hamlet haunts Shakespeare's Denmark. Throughout the immense final verse of the song, which is 74 lines long, Kennedy, as he is dying, and Dylan, as he is singing, both ask Wolfman Jack to play music for them and for us. Play Oscar Peterson, play Stan Getz, says Dylan, play Blue Skies, play Dickie Betts. He unspools a list of great American music, American music mostly, that provides the soundtrack to the murder, like Leporello reading the list of Don Giovanni's conquests in Mozart's opera. In the process, Dylan reminds us that radio is the medium of ghosts, of myth and legend, and that music is the vehicle through which historical violence turns into myth. Now, a word of conclusion. I've been suggesting that Dylan's work is marked by a dialogue between, on the one hand, the representation of events, kind of journalistic depiction of violent events on the one hand, and on the other hand, the generation of a sense of those events as myths or fables about community and responsibility. As Dylan's work unfolds, I argue he uses a wide range of techniques for dealing with this problem of representation. In his early protest songs, he uses a kind of moralizing approach, whereby he will depict a scene or an event and then comment on it with an interpretive gloss. A bit later, he seems to be interested in dialogues or connections between songs as a way of pointing to the double vision we might have on the same situation, for example, on a failing marriage. Finally, I turn to Dylan's most recent work, Murder Most Foul, where he becomes a kind of historical novelist. There he explores the status of the narrating self to enable an account of American history and culture that are intertwined, haunted by violence and loss. Listeners to Dylan's work have long been aware of its mythic nature, and we've gotten a number of wonderful presentations of some of that in the talks today. Dylan himself has created a persona that is always multiple. Bob Dylan is Bob Dylan, a biographical subject once known as Robert Zimmerman, now living in Malibu, but he is also haunted by other figures of himself. Dylan is Woody Guthrie, Dylan is Arthur Rimbaud, Dylan is Jay Gatsby, Dylan is Ernest Hemingway. My talk today has tried to expand on this common sense of Dylan's mythical fictions, to argue that the creation of myth out of the violence of history, is an important feature of the forms of the songs themselves, built into the structure. Dylan's not only a great historical poet, he's a writer who asks us to think about how we remember, about how we perceive events, and how we make stories out of something grand, something terrifying, or sometimes out of nothing at all. Thank you very much.